Thank you, everyone, for joining me on. I just went outside out of my cave and found out it's a really beautiful day outside. So thank you for joining me today. My name's Evan. I've just finished my master's at the University of Toronto with Dr. Bailey McMeans, and during that master's, we were investigating seasonal relationships in lake ecosystems. And I wanted to talk to you today about some preliminary observations that we made on fish brain size and how that might change throughout the season. And we did this on lake trout. So usually when I tell people that I looked at brains for my master's, their first question is, why on earth would you do that? And the basic answer is that temperate fish in Canada in our freshwaters, they experience some of the most drastic seasonal changes in our environment. They experience, I guess, the most drastic seasonal changes of vertebrate fishes, just because of how you'll have ice cover in the winter, and then that'll roll back, and depending on what your fish likes to eat or what water temperature it likes to be in and the lake thermal stratification, this all affects how a fish behaves in the lake. And over the past few decades, there's been investigations on seasonal changes in temperate fish and how that affects them. And there's been research on, let's say, the seasonal change in liver size or their gonad size, food consumption, their gut microbiome, relative lipid mass, metabolism, even their color perception of their eyes and their optic tecta, and obviously their behavior as well. So there's been a lot of effort put into understanding the seasonal relationship. And just to give you an example of a common thing, most of us, I'm sure, are fairly familiar with lake trout, but for those who aren't, they're a cold water adapted fish, and basically they're active all year round as a result if you're in a temperate lake such as Canada or Canada's environment, because they're cold water adapted. So in the winter, they'll tend to be in the near shore where there's kind of a higher productive area, and they'll forage on all sorts of prey fish while they're there. But when spring comes around and the ice cover rolls back and you have the lake turnover event and thermal stratification, lake trout will move into deeper offshore waters to maintain their body temperature, and this kind of thermally separates them from a lot of different productive nearshore areas, and they're limited to quick forays in and out of that nearshore zone. And then obviously as fall comes around and that destratification occurs, lake trout will actually move back into that nearshore, not only to eat, but also to spawn. And this is just basically an example of a drastic change in habitat, prey base, and temperature that one species of fish would actually experience. But to go back to brains, what makes this interesting is there's been a lot of literature that describe how fish that inhabit nearshore areas or nearshore fish species have relatively larger brains than offshore fish. And this kind of all brings back the idea of seasonality and all the other organs that we have found in lake trout specifically, such as the liver and their gonads and their metabolism. And maybe a lot of you have heard of the expensive tissue hypothesis, which is fairly controversial, or energy trade-off theory. And the idea that, if you're going to increase one energy intensive organ, you might need to decrease another. But also, in order for fish just to be able to handle these different environments, do they need to adapt cognitively? And the best measure that we have in a mass study is just to measure brain size. And there's evidence that fish could actually alter their brain size already in a natural environment based off of lab experiments. So this experiment done by Tershwell and White have found that when they have caught wild mosquito fish and they brought them into the lab, they took two different brain samples. They measured the brain size of fish that were killed immediately in the wild, and they measured the brain size of fish that were killed after adjusting to the lab over the course of a week or so. And they found that the relative brain size, that is the brain mass compared to body mass, was actually smaller in fish that have habituated to a lab environment than wild caught fish. And this is just evidence suggesting that how fish interact with their environment can very quickly, perhaps efficiently affect different organ sizes, including the brain. So this kind of naturally led into some questions, sorry. The one I was already alluding to, do fish brains change seasonally? But also, if they do, when in the year do they change seasonally, and what are the potential influences of this change? And so to investigate this, we looked at 2 lakes in Algonquin, Opeongo, and 2 rivers. And as you can tell, they're very different lakes. They have very different oromorphometries and bathymetries, and also different food webs, and both of which contain lake trout. And so this just kind of gives us an opportunity to see how different, let's say, potential brain size trends could be in vastly different lakes. Also, fortunately, Lake of Two Rivers had a telemetry array, and so this allowed us to get behavioral evidence that was directly in the same year and the same time frame as our data that we collected. And so let me just show you what we have found. So these are, of course, preliminary results. We're also looking at things like brain region size and how they contribute to this. But what we have found is that brain size, once it's been adjusted for body size, in lake trout is generally higher in the fall and winter seasons than it is in the spring and summer. So you'll see here the smaller of the lake actually has the largest relative brain size as far as lake trout brain size is concerned. And then these letters represent just multiple comparisons with p-value correction. And so this is interesting in and of itself, that we would not expect this. Normally we would think of the brain being so energy intensive to maintain and to grow that it would seem almost detrimental to have to shrink and then regrow brain material every year. But when you compare this to behavioral data that we got using telemetry, you'll notice something of a similar trend where the fall and the winter, and these vertical lines here represent our sample periods that correlate to our seasons. And also the left plot here, plot A, represents depth, and plot B represents the distance to shore, with the lower values being closer to shore. What you'll notice is that in the summer, lake trout are at their deepest, and they're also farthest away from shore. And in the fall and winter, they're actually closest to shore, and they're at their shallowest. And then spring is this kind of steep inflection point where lake trout will rapidly move offshore once either just before or just after thermal stratification. And so just to wrap this all up, because I don't actually have a huge amount of time, I don't think, going back to my questions, do fish brain size changes seasonally? It looks like they do. Obviously, we only measured lake trout. We've only looked at 2 lakes, and we don't actually know for sure if they change seasonally because we haven't looked at the same fish across all seasons. So we did kill, our samples as we collected them to look at the brains. So it's possible that, we just happen to catch larger brained fish in the fall and winter than the spring and summer. But it appears in correlation to the more accurate telemetry data that there is something going on, and that fish, or lake trout, I should say, are adjusting their brain size across the season. And it seems that they're doing this, the key inflection points seem to be spring and fall. Now, fall is when lake trout spawn. And spring is usually just after ice-off, is their very active feeding period before that stratification occurs and before they have to move into the less productive offshore waters. And what are the potential influences of seasonal changes in brain size? That we are still working on. There's the difficulty with any sort of brain analysis in wild populations is there's just so many confounding variables. It could be related to habitat complexity or habitat use and foraging behavior. It could be really regulated by water temperature or photoperiod, some of those abiotic conditions, and perhaps it could just be an evolutionarily timed system. So if, let's say, our winters get shorter, which they are, and you're having a more homogeneous seasonality, could that be detrimental to these fish, or actually are they able to adapt to such an environmental change? I think there's a lot of hope that potentially lake trout are more cognitively adaptive to new environments, but there's just so much more work that needs to be done, and I'm happy to share what we've found so far. And yeah, so I guess I'll just wrap this up as saying there's a lot of challenges with measuring this, and especially if you want to get some more in situ measurements, you need very expensive equipment to do that. But it could also lead to implications on when to sample fish, for example. If you're sampling in the fall or the winter, that could affect your sample error or your sample size or all that stuff. So yeah, I just want to thank my professor, Dr. Bailey McBeans, and some people in our lab, and also at the University of Guelph, who have helped with conducting this research. And I'm really excited to keep pursuing it. And I look forward to questions. Thank you.